I mean, if there is a problem, I can just record it and put it up afterwards, but it looks like it's doing okay.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. So we are live now then. Professor Priest, Dr. Priest, is there a preferred?
Right.
Great, okay.
Great.
You've done quite a lot of work in logic and mathematics. I'm no academic. I've not engaged with the papers and things, but I have read your very short introduction to logic, though, which is kind of how I came across your work. And I was wondering if you could at first get into what logic is and why it's important.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the word logic gets used in many ways, and its use has been quite varied throughout the history of philosophy, both East and West. But as modern logicians understand the term, logic is a theory about what kinds of inferences are valid. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, when we reason, we have certain things we assume or think are true, I call premises, and then we infer other things which kind of follow from those. So the premises give support for something, and logicians call that a conclusion. And some inferences are good and some inferences are bad. And logic is the study of which inferences are good. So when the premises really do support the conclusion and when they don't. So, a trite example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. That's okay. Compare that with all men are mortal, Socrates is a goat, therefore Socrates is mortal. Not so good, okay? Because the two premises don't really work together. So logic is really the study of which kinds of inferences are good and why. And it's been studied in the West for 2,500 years through many different periods of philosophy. But it underwent a revolution at the beginning of the 20th century when mathematicians got their hands on it for the first time. And so lots of techniques such as axiomatization, algebraicization, et cetera, came to play a central role in the study of logic. So nowadays, logic is a highly mathematical enterprise where the techniques of logic are deployed, mathematics are deployed to investigate that kind of question. Why is it important? Well, some philosophers will tell you that it's a good thing to study if you want to reason better. That's not my view. I think it's more like linguistics. Studying linguistics won't necessarily help you to speak better. Maybe occasionally when you want to phrase a complex sentence. But most people speak quite happily without knowing any grammar. And most people reason quite happily without knowing any logic. So I don't think that learning logic actually does help you to reason much better. But logic is a kind of theoretical enterprise like linguistics, which is an investigation of a particular abstract topic. In the case of linguistics, it's language. In the case of logic, it's inference.
And do you think that logic is something real then? So when we study this, is there an underlying ontology to logic, or is it just kind of an invented language, almost an illusion, maybe a coherent thing that works, but it's not actually real in any sense? And maybe even my question isn't quite, is that even a good question to ask about logic?
I'm not sure about your use of the word ontology.
Okay.
So, what most philosophers mean by ontology is the ontology, the things you presuppose that are there, that exist, if you like, when you're talking about that thing.
Okay.
Philosophers argue about the ontology of logic, whether you're dealing with sentences or propositions or abstract objects, or I don't think that's really the kind of question you're asking. From what you said, your question is more about whether there's a kind of determinacy in good inferences and bad inferences. Maybe I've misunderstood. You can tell me.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So I suppose where I'm coming from is, is there this Platonic form of the true and the false or something that somehow supervenes onto my state? Are there these abstract objects, or is logic, for example, just a set of utterances I make, but there's no real thing behind it other than the kind of sound waves that I create? Like, what's your view on what logic is fundamentally?
Okay. Well, look, most logicians would agree that when you make inferences, sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. Okay. Not many logicians are going to disagree with that. There's an objective fact of the matter. Sometimes logicians disagree about what is right and what is wrong. There are controversies in logic, okay? But for the most part, people think that they're disagreeing about something substantial. So there is a fact of the matter about which inferences are good and which inferences are bad. And what one does in the study of logic is to create theories about why this is, just as in linguistics, you create theories which are the grammars of languages, or theories which are meant to describe the grammar of a language. So in logic, you construct theories about which inferences are right and which are wrong. And some of those theories will appeal to abstract objects like propositions. Some will deal with more sort of mundane entities like sentences and so on. That's a sort of controversy, but that's a controversy within logic itself. So, sort of summarize that. The ontology, in the sense of what you're presupposing about what things are out there, as it were, is going to be slightly contentious and vary from theory to theory. But that doesn't affect the fact that most logicians will think there are objective facts about which inferences are good and which inferences are bad.
Okay. And do you kind of take a stance on that discussion? Like, would you say you lean towards, the kind of Platonist view or the sort of anti-realist view, or maybe I'm just using jargon terms that aren't even appropriate again, like in the previous question, but is there a kind of view that you take on that?
Well, given that modern logic is really a branch of mathematics, when you're doing logic, you're really dealing with mathematical entities. And of course, there's a controversy in the history of philosophy about the status of mathematical entities. Most mathematicians would take themselves to be dealing with abstract objects in some sense. Although how you even understand that is contentious. But I guess my view is that when we're doing logic, we're dealing with abstract entities. You can call them propositions if you like. That, I guess, is my, okay. There's a lot more to these things, but I think that's good enough for the present.
And perhaps one relevant question that someone's just asked in the chat as well is, if not logic, then what would you say is the best way to learn how to reason well? And I was talking to history, I think he's at the University of St. Andrews teaching the history of logic. And he was talking about how in kind of the early modern period, many of these people like Descartes and so forth, they conceived logic, their epistemology perhaps was trying to perceive things, clearly perceive categories and things. And it was more about almost removing bias in reasoning rather than about like a formal system of logic. And do you think there are these these ways of learning how to reason that kind of are outside of logic, and what are they?
Look, if you want to learn to reason, you should engage in a study where your reason is going to be put under constant pressure and challenge. You're going to be picked up if you go wrong, okay? Learning mathematics is very good for that. Learning law is very good for that. But of course, in most subjects, you reason, science, history, psychology. It's just that philosophers mathematicians and lawyers are very good at picking holes in arguments. That's what we do for a profession, right? So if you want to learn to reason well, studying one of these disciplines and having your reasoning put under pressure all the time is a very good way to learn.
And another question that we kind of got into was, you know, that the relationship between logic and mathematics. And so would you say logic is just purely almost this this branch of mathematics, at least in its modern context now? Or would you say mathematics can be reduced to logic as well, like some philosophers have tried to almost do with that, you know, logicism?
Yeah, okay. So around the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, there were some philosophers, such as the German Gottlob Frege and the British mathematician Bertrand Russell, who thought that you could reduce all mathematics to logic. That view is now no longer widely accepted. It crashed fairly spectacularly for reasons we can go into if you like, but I don't think they're necessary unless you want to. So nowadays, most mathematicians would see, and philosophers would see logic as something which you deploy in mathematics. You reason, and you have to reason very tightly in mathematics. But logic is not itself mathematics. Sorry, mathematics is not itself logic. Let me just sort of clarify something here. When you talk about mathematics, there's an important distinction between pure mathematics and applied mathematics. So pure mathematics are the kinds of, when you're dealing with the abstract structures themselves, numbers, topological spaces, categories, algebras, okay. These are sorts of things that pure mathematicians investigate. But then there's applied mathematics. And applied mathematics is when you apply a bit of pure mathematics to investigate another area, such as physics or economics or linguistics. I mean, all of these bits of science you use mathematical tools in. And of course, you've got to find the right bit of mathematics to use. Now, modern logic is a branch of applied mathematics because we're looking for the right kinds of mathematical tools to use to analyze valid inference. So in that sense, logic is mathematics, but it's one kind of applied mathematics, I think.
So then the next kind of thing I wanted to discuss with you was sort of our systems of logic. So there's various kind of languages. So we might talk about like classical logic, for example, or now there's like quantum logics. And you know, I'm again no expert in this, but there's these various languages with different almost axioms and so forth. Are all of these, do you think all of these systems are flawed in some sense? Is there a true system of logic out there, do you think, that we might discover?
Okay, so you know, people have been proposing systems of logic in the West now for 2,500 years. The first person to produce a theory of logic was Aristotle. But it's about the same time, just after, there's a bunch of logicians in Athens called the Stoics, who produced a quite different system of logic. And in the Middle Ages, in the medieval universities, a number of different systems of logic were proposed and studied. What we now call classical logic is the logic that was invented by Russell and Frege around the turn of the 20th century. And that gave a different theory of what follows from what and why from the previous theories. And it was much, much better than anything that had gone before. It was much more powerful, much cleaner, partly because the new mathematical techniques were being used. And it sort of pretty much became the standard logic of the day, and it still is. And that's called classical logic. But it has certain things which appear to be shortcomings. So ever since the invention of classical logic, logicians have been worrying about its problems and coming up with different theories. And these are called non-classical logics. And the study of non-classical logic has taken off spectacularly in the second half of the 20th century. So there are now a very large number of non-classical logics which differ from classical logic. It's normally assumed that at least one logic is right, although logicians, as I said, disagree about which logic is right sometimes. These are debates in the philosophy of logic. But you have to get clear about what that means. And maybe an analogy here is geometry. So up to about the 18th century, there was only one geometry. It was Euclidean geometry. It was the only system of geometry that people were familiar with. And people assumed that that was the right geometry to apply in the branch of applied mathematics where you're studying the structure of space. Okay. So something amazing happened just after that, which is the invention of non-Euclidean geometry. So mathematicians discovered that Euclidean geometry isn't the only formal geometry. There are all kinds of different geometries, hyperbolic, Riemann, and so on. Some of them have constant curvature, some don't. We don't need to go into the details. But we now know that there are many, many systems of pure geometry. The question then becomes, which is the right system of geometry to use for the application that people originally had in mind, namely determining the structure of space and time of the cosmos. And it sort of turned out that Euclidean geometry isn't the right one. You need a non-Euclidean geometry. So if you're going to do, the theory of general relativity, you're going to take the geometry of the space-time of the cosmos to be a non-Euclidean one. Well, it's a bit like that in logic. Now we have all these non-classical logics, as well as classical logic, of course, and as pieces of mathematics, they're all fine. They all have that axiomatization, semantics, algebraicizations, and so on. And there's no suggestion there that any of them is right or wrong. They're all perfectly good pieces of mathematics. But then the question is, hey, well, which is the right bit of mathematics to apply for what logicians have traditionally been interested in, which is, reasoning what follows from what. And that's where the philosophical debates come in. So different logicians have held in the 20th century that different pure logics are the right logic to apply for this purpose. So earlier on you mentioned quantum logic. The earliest non-classical logic was something called intuitionism, or intuitionist logic, which was invented by some Dutch mathematicians around 1910, 1920, 1930. And they were very critical of some of the principles of classical logic. For example, in classical logic, there's this thing called the principle of excluded middle. That something's either true or it's false. So it's either raining or it's not. Either there's a solution to Riemann's hypothesis or not. Either the continuum hypothesis in set theory is true or it's not. And the mathematicians, the intuitionist mathematicians, were very critical of some of these things because they thought that, in mathematics, there's no objective world out there. So they disagree with classical mathematicians about the ontology of what they're talking about. They say in mathematics, the only standards of truth are proof. And so if you can't prove A and you can't prove its negation, neither is true. So something of the form A or not A or it's not the case today, is not necessarily going to be true. And they constructed intuitionistic logic. And the principle of excluded middle is not valid in intuitionistic logic. So that's one debate. That's one of the earliest debates about non-classical logic in the 20th century. And now we have many non-classical logics, and so there are lots of corresponding debates.
Have you ever had the pleasure of talking to a presuppositional apologist?
Presuppositional?
Yeah, so there's this form of apologetics called presuppositional apologetics, where essentially what they say is that, you know, everyone's bringing their set of presuppositions to the table, and Christianity is the only worldview that can provide a coherent set of presuppositions, or a set of presuppositions that makes sense. And often a lot of them will appeal to things like the law of non-contradiction, for example, in order to try and prove their point. And I don't know if you're familiar with a philosopher called Alex Malpass, but there's a very funny conversation between him and a presuppositional apologist, where he's saying kind of like, you know, this sentence is false. Maybe that's true. And so some people in the chat are saying to ask you about statements like this sentence is false. Like, I don't know if I can quite pronounce the word dialethism. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And you know what those are. I think is there something about you know, like the Barber paradox, the set paradox in Wittgenstein's work, where he's saying is that maybe there's just this one issue. I've not really read Wittgenstein, so I couldn't say. But what's your view on all that kind of thing, or if you were to give an introduction to that to people?
Okay. Well, first of all, I haven't come across presuppositionists. One of the great virtues of modern formal logic is that it forces you to make your presuppositions clear in a certain sense. Because you have a very tightened analysis of reasoning, it's clear when you're making jumps. And so one of the great virtues of modern logic is it forces you to make presuppositions, or at least many of them, explicit. Okay. That, of course, doesn't tell you when your presuppositions are true or false. That's going to be another debate, but at least it forces you to be clear about what those are. But once you're clear about them, then you can have a discussion about, you know, the truth of these things. So a number of the debates in modern philosophical logic are precisely about the theories of what follows from what and why. And I don't think any modern logician would say this is simply a matter of faith. There are too many arguments, pro and con, for it to be, you know, a matter of faith. This is, if these things are going to be resolved, they're going to be resolved by rational argument, as, you know, questions hopefully often are. So that's presupposition. Now, what your listeners are asking about is something called dialethism. Now, some things are contradictions. So the sun is shining, the sun is not shining. All men are mortal, some men are not mortal. I'm in New York, I'm not in New York, and so on. Okay, so these are contradictions. Now, a moment ago, we talked about the principle of excluded middle. Everything's either true or false. There's a kind of dual principle called the principle of non-contradiction, which is nothing can be both true and false. So no contradiction can be true, all right? Because if I say I'm in New York and I'm not in New York, well, then one of those is true and the other isn't. So they can't both be true together, right? So that's the principle of non-contradiction. And the principle of non-contradiction has been high orthodoxy since Aristotle, with a few notable exceptions, such as Hegel. But the fact that he's an exception just shows how orthodox the whole principle was. Now, some modern logicians, and I'm one of them, have started to challenge the principle of non-contradiction. So a dialetheia is a jargon word, and it just means a contradiction that's true. Sort of thing you can't have if the principle of non-contradiction is right. And dialetheism is the view that there are dialetheism. So I'm a dialetheist. Now, dialetheism is not a view about logic as such. It's a view about what kinds of things can be true or false. But it has an impact on logic. Because in orthodox logic, classical logic, there's a principle which says everything follows from a contradiction. So if you suppose that I'm in New York and not in New York, it follows that Trump is a wise man, Trump is an idiot, that the moon is green, that Trump is green, that you're a pig, that Socrates was a woman. Everything follows, right? So what this principle says, once you get some inconsistent information, everything blows up in your face, everything follows. Now, that's kind of an unintuitive principle of inference. If I tell you I'm in New York and not in New York, well, then nothing much follows about Donald Trump from that, just because it doesn't seem to be about Donald Trump at all. However, for what it's worth, it is an orthodox principle of logic. We can talk about why if you like, but just take my word for it for the moment. Suppose you think that some contradictions are true, and suppose you think this principle of inference, which is called explosion, is valid, then you're committed to the truth of everything. And that's just crazy, okay? So if you're a dialetheist, you've got to subscribe to a principle. You've got to subscribe to the correctness of a logic where contradictions don't imply everything. And these go by another technical name, paraconsistent logics. So if you're a dialetheist, you're going to subscribe to a paraconsistent logic. Okay. Final part of your question. When people are told that some contradictions might be true, they naturally ask for examples. And that's fair enough. And modern dialetheists have discussed a number of examples, but nearly everyone's favorite are the paradox of self-reference. So the oldest of these was discovered 2,500 years ago by a Greek philosopher called Eubulides, and it's called the liar paradox. This concerns a sentence which says, this very sentence I'm now saying is not true. If you like, this sentence is false. Okay, ask yourself, is it true or is it false? Well, suppose it's true. Hey, it says it's false. So if it's true, well, it's false. All right. Suppose it's false. Well, it says it's false, so it's got to be true. So if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. You seem to be in a contradiction. Now, you might think that this is a kind of party game, but logicians have taken it very seriously for 2,500 years. And one reason why you cannot take it as a party game any longer, even if you felt so inclined, is the contradictions of this form turned up in the foundations of mathematics at the turn of the century. One of these contradictions is Russell's paradox. It's a paradox about sets. And it goes like this. Some sets are members of themselves. So the set of abstract ideas is an abstract idea, so it's a member itself. The set of chairs is not a chair, it's an abstract idea. So the set of chairs is not a chair. So some sets are members of themselves, some aren't. Okay, now, just consider the set of all those sets which aren't members themselves. Ask whether that's a member itself or not. Well, if it is a member itself, it's one of the things that ain't a member itself. So it isn't a member itself. On the other hand, if it is a member itself, hang on, I'm getting confused. If it's a member itself, it's one of the things that ain't. So if it is, it isn't. And if it ain't a member itself, it's one of the things that ain't a member itself. So it is a member itself. It's just like the liar with sets. And Russell's paradoxes are one of an enormous family of paradoxes of this kind, which turned up in the foundations of mathematics. A lot of them are quite technical, but they're really hard problems in something called set theory. So there's this family of paradoxes of self-reference, and they have been discussed, as I said, for 2,500 years in principle. Not the new ones, but the new ones are just showing there's more of the same. And it's a mark of how hard they are that even after 2,500 years of discussion, there's still no consensus about how you solve these things, which is kind of amazing. That logicians have been thinking about these things for 2,500 years, and there's still no agreement. So what dialetheists say is, hey, the people who've been trying to solve these paradoxes, they're doing the wrong kind of thing. They're trying to look for something that's wrong with the reasoning because it ends in a contradiction. No. There's nothing wrong with the reasoning. It's fine reasoning. It ends in a contradiction, so contradictions are true. Okay, so that's the kind of example of things which many modern dialetheists take to be true contradictions. It's one of the ones that's easiest to get your head around.
So someone has asked if you could finally settle the debate of whether it's spelled dialetheism or dialethism. But I was thinking as you were speaking, perhaps leaving the two different spellings might be a kind of ironic twist to the to the kind of concept there.
Yeah, well, let me quickly answer that question.
Sure.
I mean, it's a neologism that was coined by my old Australian friend, now sadly dead for many years, Richard Routley. And we decided we needed a word to describe the view that some contradictions are true. And we tried to find an existent word in many different languages. So we went down to the library at the Australian National University in Canberra and looked at the Latin dictionary, the Greek dictionary, the Gaelic dictionary, the Hebrew dictionary, the Irish dictionary, and we couldn't find a word. So we decided we'd have a neologism. It's kind of ugly, but so be it. A dialetheia, two-way truth, something that faces both truth and falsity. Okay, so we agreed to use that word. But we forgot how to agree how to spell it. So if you take, there's an English word, alethic, derives from the Greek aletheia. And usually in alethic, the E is omitted. So when Richard spelt the word, he omitted the E in dialetheia, in dialethic, whereas I kept it in. So that's how the confusion arose. I think with the E has become more standard now, just because I've written more about this stuff than Richard did. In fact, Richard died in '96, so he hasn't been writing much since then. And I still miss him.
So for the dialetheist who accepts this position, then, is there much kind of discussion about what kind of things these contradictory objects might be, or what, why they exist at all? Any kind of discussion around that's conclusive in any regard, or is it kind of like this weird thing we've just come across, and then it's like who knows?
Well, there's certainly a debate about which kinds of areas might have dialetheas in them. My own view about that is you have to treat everything on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
But often people say to me, well, how do I know that it's safe to assume that in this area there are no true contradictions? And what I usually say is this: well, you're asking how you know whether something's true, okay? Question: how do you know whether something's true in general? Give me an algorithm for determining whether something's true. You can't do it. This is one of the big lessons of philosophy of science in the 20th century. To determine the truth of something, there's no algorithm to determine whether something's true. You have to just look at the evidence in each particular case.
Could I ask what you mean by true there? Just because, again, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. Whatever you think it means, doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah, it's because I'm not sure. Sorry.
Yeah. So there are many different theories of truth, and philosophers will argue about this for another 2,500 years. But dialetheism is not committed to any particular view about the nature of truth. Truth means whatever you want it to mean, and whatever you think is the right meaning. Okay, let me see, where were we?
So there's no algorithm that.
Okay, good. So if you want to know whether something's true, all you can do is look at the evidence. David Hume said that a wise person is a person who apportions their belief according to the evidence. Well, that seems about right to me. So if that's right, there's no algorithm for determining whether some contradictions are true or not. You've got to do everything on a case-by-case basis. And that's kind of disappointing, but that's always sort of a feature of adult life, I'm afraid.
Another question that's come up is about infinity, and whether you think infinity is something that can exist, whether infinity is like a real concept. What are your kind of views on infinity? What do you think infinity is, and can there be an infinity that exists?
Okay. Look, there are standard mathematical answers to these questions, and I think they're right.
Okay.
So towards the end of the 19th century, most mathematicians or philosophers thought the notion of infinity was incoherent. And the subject was revolutionized by this German-Danish mathematician, Georg Cantor, who produced the modern theory of infinity. Now, why did people think that the notion of infinity was incoherent? Well, they were familiar with the following kind of situation. Take the ordinary numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, blah, 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 blah. Take the even ones, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, etc., etc. It's pretty obvious there are a few of those, the numbers, because I've missed out all the odd ones, right? But it's easy enough to see that you compare up the even numbers with all the numbers, 0, 0, 1, 2. Okay, so just write a series. Go. Just in one line, write all the numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Another line, write the even numbers, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and just pair them up. And you can do that because every number has a double. So because you can pair off the even numbers and numbers, it looks as though they're the same number each, but that's crazy because, you know, there are fewer even numbers. So that was why many people thought that the notion of infinity was incoherent. What Cantor did was something very clever. He said, no, there are in fact exactly as many even numbers as numbers. You just got it wrong because you're thinking about the finite. And in the finite, if you take a set and throw away some members, you're going to get a smaller set. But it's exactly the mark of the infinite that you can take a set and throw away some of its members and still have the same size. So Cantor said, look, it's the very definition of an infinite set that you can throw away stuff and still have the set of the same size. And that's pretty much the modern definition of infinitude. Are there infinite sets? Absolutely. The natural numbers is one of them. You know, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another one of Cantor's amazing discoveries was there are different sizes of infinity. So if you take the natural numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's an infinite set, goes on forever, right? Turns out that that's the smallest size of infinity. You can find larger size of infinity. So for example, if you take the set of not real numbers, if you take the set not of natural numbers, but decimals, real numbers, 0.12345, 0.13, 0.13 recurring, all those, it turns out that there are more of those than the ordinary counting numbers, natural numbers. They can't be put into a one-to-one correspondence like the even numbers and the natural numbers. What Cantor proved was that for any size of infinity, there's a greater size of infinity. And it goes on to mind-numbing levels of size of infinity. Okay. This is the basis of modern investigation of infinity. So are there infinities? Yeah, absolutely. Mathematicians will tell you lots of them. They can tell you lots of infinite sets, lots of infinities of different sizes. This is not contentious in modern mathematics. This is orthodox modern contemporary mathematics.
Well, many philosophers who are proponents of like the Kalam cosmological argument would argue from the impossibility of an infinite as almost like a, like a hidden premise there in their argument. So they might use, examples of like a Hilbert's hotel and things of that nature to try and demonstrate that an actual infinity doesn't exist. So would you say that an actual infinity, that those arguments are unsuccessful, that an actual infinity
yes.
is a thing again? Yeah.
Yes. Look, it may be that the cosmos is finite. I think probably contemporary cosmological theories, to the extent they understand them, say that the cosmos is finite. But there's no logical impossibility in an infinite cosmos. The Hilbert Hotel stuff is perfectly coherent mathematically and physically. Indeed, I mean, even if contemporary theories tell you that the cosmos is finite, if you just look at Newtonian science, it was assumed that the physical cosmos was infinite. It goes on infinitely in both all directions in space and at least one direction in time, which is the future. Newton believed that the world had been created, so it wasn't infinite in time past, but there's nothing incoherent about that mathematically either. So you're never going to prove that the cosmos is finite by mathematical reasoning. If it's finite, it's going to be a discovery of physics.
One question someone has asked, and perhaps this might be the last maybe predominantly maths and logic-y based question before I want to get into some of your kind of like influences of like Eastern philosophy on where you're coming from. But this question is kind of to do with whether you think maths is like a true, the question's worded whether you think maths is a true mapping of the universe. But I guess what that means is why do you think the world seems to be fundamentally mathematical? What do you kind of think that is? Why does nature seem to be this way? And maybe there's something in there about temporal regularities and things like that.
Yeah, this is a very good question. And it was raised by a philosopher of science whose name I'm now blanking on. Look, pure mathematicians investigate pure mathematical structures, okay? In some sense, these are objective structures which we're trying to investigate. But we can apply mathematics to investigate all kinds of things. Certainly physics, physical structures, but also economics and linguistics and so on. And it's often the case that when we start to investigate these systems, we can find bits of mathematics which actually do quite a good job at being able to describe the application, the physical cosmos. Let's take that as an example. How come? Why does mathematics do such a good job in, say, theoretical physics? I mean, it certainly has its problems, but just look at the successes that mathematical physics has had, from flying aeroplanes to the technology that we're using now to talk, etc., etc. How come the cosmos is such that you can use mathematics in this way? So this is, as I say, a fairly standard argument, a question in the philosophy of science. I don't actually know a good argument. I don't know a good answer to that question. It may just be that we're damn well lucky that the cosmos is like that. If it weren't, maybe it wouldn't be the kind of place that let me put it this way.
Sure.
We exist, okay? We are highly structured beings, and a lot of the rest of the cosmos is highly structured. We could not exist if the cosmos were not highly structured. So maybe there's no a priori reason why the cosmos has to be highly structured. It could be a complete fucking mess, okay? But it ain't, because we're here, okay? Given that it has this structure, given that we're here, it must have this structure. So if you want to figure out what the structure is, then it behoves us to find the right bit of mathematics to describe that structure. So as I say, I don't think there's any a priori reason why we must have success when we apply mathematics. But given that the cosmos does have this determinate structure, and that's a contingent fact, then we can apply mathematics in this way. That's the best I can do.
Sure. And just while you were talking, actually, something that came up, I thought as well, perhaps to also touch on a bit of philosophy of mind. Why do you think we're able to, or what do you think it is when we represent mathematics in our mind, and the fact that we're also able to kind of create things in the world? You know, so I often talk to the position I hold currently is kind of like an epistemic idealism. And sometimes when I talk to people who are, I don't know if it's an appropriate way of describing them, like metaphysical naturalists, they will say, well, you know, things like logic and mathematics, they're just a description of reality, but nothing more. But when you kind of, maybe I'm just arguing from incredulity, but when I think about my ability to, say, understand logic and then take my representation of that and create a series of like logic gates and transistors that actually compute something in the world, like that concept works in the world in some sense as well. And that's very, like that's something that makes me think, you know, it doesn't seem to me to make sense then that my mental representation is just some random biological confusion or something, or I don't know what your thoughts are on that. It's a little bit incoherent in my mind still, my thoughts surrounding all those things.
Okay, look, I don't know what I can say to be helpful here.
Sure.
People are very good at creating things. One of the things they're good at creating is abstract structures, ideas, theories, counting systems, etc., etc. Obviously, there's something in our evolution which has given us the ability to do this, and presumably that's because it gives us some kind of evolutionary advantage. All right. So for whatever reason, we do have this ability. In particular, we can invent bits of mathematics. So as I said, here we're talking about pure mathematics. Okay, so we can invent counting systems, we can invent set theoretic structures. Okay. That's pure mathematics. Then there's applied mathematics, is what you get when you apply some of these abstract systems to something else, namely the physical cosmos, or the theory of evolution, or whatever. And then we come back to the question we've just discussed of, you know, why these bits of mathematics should be successful in this. We talked about that already. So is there something which is in evolution which has shaped our ability to do this? Yeah, I think that it must be the case. Is that partly responsible for the fact that we are quite good at finding mathematical structures to describe the physical cosmos and other, you know, applied systems? Yeah, maybe. I don't know that I've got much more to say about that.
Yeah, sure. No problem. I wanted to ask you then about your kind of study of Eastern philosophies and religions and how this has kind of contributed to your worldview. And I thought as well to say a bit about myself, which might be interesting. So about 2 or so years ago, I became a Christian, and I recently kind of converted out of Christianity to agnosticism. And before that, like I've been interested in certain forms of Eastern religion and philosophy, and like kind of the more psychedelic culture side of things, and recently reading Aldous Huxley's Island, and it's making me want to kind of go back and investigate a bit of that stuff a little bit more, see what certain Eastern philosophers had to say about their metaphysics, so to speak. So how has Eastern philosophy kind of contributed to your worldview?
Okay. Look, a bit of autobiography. I was brought up as a Christian. In my early 20s, I decided that Christianity was false, because the problem of evil is an absolute killer. I don't see any good way in which a God who is even half good, half knowing, half powerful could allow the amount of gratuitous suffering that we see in the world. As someone said, a 10-year-old with access to a telephone could stop a lot of it, and God's a bit more powerful than that. Okay, of course, this is an enormously contentious question. Christian theologians have been discussing this for a long time, and I don't really think there's any satisfactory answer. That's my view. That's the conclusion I came to. So I ceased to be a Christian, and since then I have no religion.
Would you describe yourself as an atheist or
yes.
Agnostic? Okay, sure.
Atheist.
And you would say that then, so atheism for you is like a belief about the world that there is no God, like the affirmative.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Correct.
Sure.
All right. But the fact that you think certain religious views are false doesn't mean that you think everything that a certain religion subscribes to is false.
Sure.
So, Christians believe there's a God that you should worship. I don't believe that. But Christians say that you should be compassionate to your neighbor, the parable of the Samaritan and so on. I think that's good. You should be compassionate to your neighbor. So I don't disbelieve everything that Christians claim, just some of the things. And of course, compassion is not the prerogative of any one religion. Buddhism is also a religion in which compassion plays an absolutely central role. So, we're not dealing with kind of things which are specific to any particular religion. However, if you don't subscribe to a particular religion, there's a question of which are the claims that particular religions make you do subscribe to. And as I say, I subscribe to the fact that compassion is a very good moral ideal and so on. All right, now, I didn't really know much about the traditions of Asian philosophy or religion until maybe 25 years ago. Just wasn't in my culture. But then I started to read some philosophy from the Asian traditions. And the one I've read most is Buddhism. And when I read Buddhist philosophy, I started to think, hey, there's a lot of stuff here that I really agree with. Both metaphysical stuff about how the world works, ethical stuff about how you should live. And I thought, yeah, I can subscribe to most of those things. There's nothing I have to take on faith. It's not like in Buddhism, there is no God, okay? A fortiori, you cannot have anything revealed by God. So you don't have to believe something simply because you've been told. The reason you believe something is because it makes sense, and that's what the Buddha says in one of the sutras. So examining a number of these claims, they seem to make good sense to me. So I subscribe to a lot of the things you find in Buddhist philosophy. Actually, there are different kinds of Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism isn't one religion any more than Christianity is. But some of the things which are core to most kinds of Buddhism I subscribe to. But I'm not a Buddhist by religion. I don't practice Buddhism as a religion. I don't meditate. I don't go to. I'm not a member of. Okay, so in Buddhism, there's this thing called taking refuge, which means formally calling yourself a Buddhist and attaching yourself to a group. It's like being confirmed or your mitzvah. I don't know what the other religions have, but it's sort of signing on to the dotted line, if you like. And I've never done that. I have no desire to do that. I think most Orthodox religions are corrupt, and I include Buddhism in that. So I'm not a religious Buddhist, but there's a great deal about Buddhist philosophy that I subscribe to, just because it seems to me that it stacks up rationally. You can argue for them. We were talking about David Hume a while back as to the rational person apportions their belief according to the evidence and the reasons. And for me, a lot of these parts of Buddhist philosophy, the reasons are actually there to make them good, rational things to believe.
Do you think when it comes to looking at Buddhism, that the sort of language that it uses to describe some of these concepts is the appropriate level of describing them? Do you think translating some of those truths into, like modern scientific language about in terms of psychology is the appropriate way of approaching it? Or do you think it at some level has to be enshrined in kind of narrative or mythology and stuff like that for it to be?
Okay, good. So like many religions, Buddhism has various mythologies, stories about sort of demigods and divinities and astral realms and so on, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, for example. But most of these religions of Buddhism have legends about the Buddha and the miraculous things he did and so on and so forth. I don't believe any of that stuff. I have a scientific worldview. Now, Buddhism makes various claims about people and how they work, the way their mind works. They didn't know much about the brain 2,500 years ago in India, or 1,500 years ago in China. And a number of the things that are claimed, modern science seems to have, if not shown to be correct, then let's put it this way, that many of the Buddhist claims about how the mind works seem to be panning out in contemporary cognitive psychology. If that's so, then this is some kind of empirical confirmation of a number of Buddhist views. And I believe, if I remember right, the Dalai Lama was on record as saying, if there's something in Buddhism which is shown to be wrong by modern science, then modern science is right and the Buddhist view must go. It's a naturalist worldview, which is part of its appeal, I think, to the people in the West who have this sort of naturalist perspective on life. So I think modern science can help us deepen, revise, improve a number of Buddhist views, and so much the better.
Sure. I think that's a good answer. Some of what people have been asking from when you said that you think some of these things like loving your neighbor, for example, they're asking, are you a moral realist in terms of your kind of like meta-ethical position, if you have one?
I guess it could depend what you mean by moral realism. But the quick answer is yes.
Okay.
Look, one of the central tenets of most Buddhisms is that life is characterized by this, there's a Sanskrit word called dukkha. It's often translated as suffering, but that's not a great translation because it has many resonances. Okay, it includes mental and physical suffering, but it includes frustration, anxiety, dissatisfaction, fear, all this kind of negative stuff in life that you don't like. the first noble truth is, hey, life is like that. Get your head around it. And then it goes on and tells you some things you can do to make things better. So it's not actually a pessimistic view. It's actually realistic. Get your head around it. Life is like that. Okay, so then there's this presupposition that suffering is bad, and what we should be doing is trying to get rid of it. And not just, I should, of course, be trying to get rid of my own suffering, but I should be trying to get rid of other people's. Okay, why? Well, that's an interesting question, but that's the view. Now, do I take these views to be objectively right, that people suffer, that suffering is a bad thing and that we should get rid of it? Yes, I do. And if that counts as moral realism, I'm a moral realist.
And is there anything for, like, would you say there are like moral facts, or that there is like a form of the good or something along those lines, or would you say that that's not even necessary to be that kind of moral realist?
Yeah. So this brings us back to the question of how you understand truth, whether it's kind of corresponds to objective facts in reality in some sense. Philosophers go different ways on this, and I'm not sure that it's necessary to sort these out to believe in the objectivity of morality. Whatever makes a view true, whatever gives it objectivity, whatever it makes me right when I say it's right to help people who are suffering, as opposed to, say, someone who says, oh, if someone's suffering, screw them, let them go, okay? In whatever sense I think I'm right, they're wrong, and that's objective. And my view is true and theirs isn't. That's fine by me as far as this debate goes. With my philosophical colleagues, I'll argue about what truth means another day, but you don't have to determine that to try and figure out, the best way to live and the objectivity of the best way to live.
And then kind of similarly to that, someone's asked, what is it that you think about the kind of like moral argument for a God's existence, if you've given that much thought?
Okay, there's a whole bunch of arguments in Western philosophy for the existence of God.
It's probably something like what William Lane Craig goes with. So if God does not exist, then objective moral facts and values don't exist. Objective moral facts and values don't exist. So modus tollendo tollens, God exists, kind of thing. Something like that.
I don't believe one of the premises.
Okay.
I think that objective moral truths do exist. But a lot of people feel funny about these, partly because it's sometimes claimed that moral facts are kind of spooky. The world's made up of atoms and protons and whatever, and you don't find moral values in atoms and protons. That's absolutely right. But there are lots of things that are objective truths, which you're not going to find corresponding to anything in the physical world of atoms, obviously. So, for example, it's true that in the game of chess, a rook can move along ranks and files. That's objectively true. Somebody who doesn't believe that has just got it wrong, okay? You're not going to be able to, that doesn't correspond to anything about protons and electrons, right? It's objectively true nonetheless. It's objectively true that Australia is in the southern hemisphere. Actually, maybe that's not a good example, because maybe that does correspond to protons and neutrons in some sense. But it's objectively true that America has two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. That's true. Anyone who thinks otherwise just doesn't understand American politics. Does that correspond to anything in the natural world? No. So there are lots of things which are objectively true and false, which are not going to be reducible in any obvious sense to the sort of the fundamental particles of the cosmos. So the fact that protons and neutrons don't code moral values, well, they don't code a lot of social constructions or constructions in games either. That's, the world is a much more variegated place than that.
Do you believe that people can choose what they believe?
Well, it depends what you mean can. Have the right to? Sure.
Yeah, I suppose that the
what
word...
Of course not.
I think there's this philosophical sort of jargon term, is it doxastic non-voluntarism, where... Yeah, is that something that you would subscribe to, that position, or?
No, I think some beliefs tend to force themselves on us. So I'm now talking to you by Zoom, and I'd have a very hard time believing that. It's kind of, it seems to force itself on me. I guess I could get myself into a headspace where I'm thinking this is an illusion, but it'd be really fucking hard, right?
Right.
Whereas some things, it seems you do resolve. So, as I said earlier, I was a Christian, and then I decided that I just couldn't subscribe to the views. And that was in some sense a conscious choice. I mean, I weighed up the evidence and made it what it seemed to me to be a rational decision. But, neither Christianity nor atheism forced themselves on me in the same way that my belief that I'm talking to you by Zoom forced themselves on me. So, yeah, I think that a number of our beliefs, we do have quite a lot of voluntary control over.
And so I suppose in the philosophy of mind, there are some kind of, I don't know much about the history of the philosophy of mind, I've got to say, but what seem to be kind of contemporary views like panpsychism that seem to be emerging to do with consciousness. Do you have any opinions surrounding that? It might seem that is a view that's possibly compatible with a lot of these Eastern doctrines from my limited understanding of Eastern philosophy.
Okay, look, don't lump Eastern religions in the same basket. They are not.
Okay.
There are enormous differences between Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism. There are lots of them. They're different religions. They have very different philosophies, just as there are many different religions and philosophies that come out of the Middle East. Panpsychism is certainly a view. So maybe your listeners or viewers don't know what panpsychism is. Panpsychism is essentially the view that everything in the cosmos has a mind, maybe a rudimentary mind, but a mind nonetheless. So, my diary, for example, has a mind. The trees outside have minds, maybe rudimentary minds, but panpsychism is the view that everything physical in the world, everything in the world is sort of permeated with a bit of mentality. Okay, that's a view. I don't believe it. Some people think there are good arguments for it. I've never found an argument that's persuasive. And until I find a view, until I find an argument I find persuasive, it just seems to me to be wrong on factual grounds, because as far as we understand it, mentality supervenes on certain neurological structures.
Would you say you're a dualist in that sense?
No.
No. Okay.
No. I'm not a dualist because I think people have minds and trees. Okay, let me rephrase that. People have mental abilities, but so do lots of animals, okay? Carrots don't. Now, why is that? Well, because mental activity and abilities depends, as far as we know, on certain neuroanatomical structures, which people tend to have on a good day. So do mammals, and so do doubtless other kinds of creatures as well. Trees and carrots do not have those structures. And so as long as our understanding of mentality says that it depends on neuroanatomy, or having the appropriate neuroanatomy, then I don't think that that trees and carrots have any kind of mentality at all. Okay, so as I, panpsychism is a philosophical view. I might be right, could turn out to be right, but come back to Hume. The wise person apportions their beliefs according to the evidence. As far as I can see, there just ain't good evidence.
Sure. And then a question from our resident mathematician is, could it be that dialethism is a result of a flawed language system and not a feature of reality?
There's a kind of dualism here, which I think is selling matters short. Dialethism is a view that certain things are true, those things are contradictions, and those contradictions are expressed in language. All right, now, when certain claims expressed in language are true, what makes them so? Two things: the meanings of the words and the world that they describe. So, for example, New York City is in the United States. That's true. What makes it a true statement? Well, it's partly to do with the fact of the meanings of the words New York City, United States, but it's also something to do with the geography of the Western Hemisphere. Okay. So when things are true, in general, both language and the world are playing a role. There might be certain degenerate cases, all bachelors are male, if you like. That's one of these degenerate cases where the world doesn't seem to play much role at all. But generally speaking, when statements are true, it's partly due to the meanings of the language we use and partly due to the world. So for truth in general, this is not an either-or thing. And the truth of contradictions in particular is going to be, a special case of that. So I'm inclined to reject these kind of either-or way in which the question was phrased.
Okay, sure. And then I suppose, is there anything else relevant to kind of some of the things you've said or our discussion that you'd want to say before we kind of wrap this up?
No, we've covered a number of different areas. There's of course a great deal more to be said about all of them.
Of course, yeah.
Maybe we should see if some of your hearers have got any more questions.
Yeah, sure. Well, if anyone does have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And one, just having a look there, someone saying, do you have any examples of those contradictions? But I can't remember what. I think that was when you were taught your response to panpsychism, possibly.
Well, the contradictions about dialethism, we talked about the paradox of self-reference. I mean, that's the main one. There are others we can talk about if you like. But that's going back to a long previous stage of the discussion.
I think the question was asked when you were answering the panpsychism question, though. So I think you must have said something is contradictory, and that question is about that. But I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not remembering.
Okay, I don't remember saying anything of that form. Maybe I'm just forgetting it. I mean, if your listener can remind me,
yeah,
be
sure.
Good.
I'll ask him. And then just in your last response, something I was thinking in what you said about one part of something being true almost there was that you said in virtue of the meaning of the language. What is it for language to have meaning? You know, I've heard again some conversations between people who want to almost completely reduce everything to almost physical, you know, like the way that the particles move in waves and things. And to me, and this is where I say I've got this position of epistemic idealism, where it seems that the things I'm aware of have a qualitative aspect and fundamentally, and I almost can't get beyond that to the external world. And what do you think about you know, why things have meaning, and but would you say as well there is a way to get to the external world, you know, and is it in Berkeley's Three Dialogues where Philoneus says something like, you know, if you can conceive for me a tree which exists independently of the mind, I'll abandon this position. Is there a way out of that kind of problem?
Okay, set Berkeley aside for the moment.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot in that. I appreciate it.
Where we started was that language has meanings. Not just language, of course, but lots of things have meaning. You know, music can have meaning. Visual art can have meaning. But let's just stick to language. Mm-hmm. How does it acquire this meaning? What is it for it to be meaningful? This is a hard question in the philosophy of language. And I'm not sure there's any consensus on the question in contemporary philosophy. It's fairly clear that words mean in some sense because of the way we use them. I mean, the word cat means cat because I and most other people apply it to little furry creatures, right? If I applied it to long yellow animals with black spots and long necks, I'd just be getting it wrong. I mean, it would mean giraffes, not cats. But then language is structured. So you can't just leave it at the level of single words. I mean, there's got to be a way that the words relate to each other, their grammatical structure and so on. So all these must play a role in meaning. Now, exactly how they determine meaning and whether meaning is coded in abstract objects, that's something that the philosophers disagree about. So beyond that, we're getting to very deep philosophical water. But very few people are going to suppose that the language we use doesn't apply to the world around us. That when I talk about cats, I'm talking about those little furry creatures. When I'm talking about Donald Trump, I'm talking about the guy who lives in Washington. Is there a world beyond my mind? So now we come to Berkeley. Of course, I think there is. Like most people, I think the world is. Donald Trump is not in my mind. Yeah. Unfortunately, not simply in my mind anyway. So philosophers have argued that the whole world is in your mind. I don't subscribe to those views at all. The world is out there and independent of me, and it'll go on existing long after I'm dead. With a bit of luck anyway. Not for me, but for the rest of the world. And we can use that language to describe the world. That's not rocket science. That's just sort of plain common sense.
No, I certainly I'm not, I suppose, in my position denying an external world, but it's more to do with reality as it manifests itself to me. So if I'm talking about things that I'm certain of, well, it seems to be, for example, the things that come to me through my senses, for example. And I'm always fundamentally just perceiving them. I can't get at the thing in itself, and that seems to be like quite a problem for me because all I can kind of meaningfully talk about is almost this coherent representation I have before my seat of consciousness. And if I can't get to the external world, say something like metaphysical naturalism might be true, but I'd never be able to prove it or never be able to get to it to say that that's the case, because I'd always have this illusion of my own experience before me. Do you think there's a way, you know, like that specific problem almost of can you conceive of a tree which exists independently of the mind? Is there a way out of that sort of thing?
Oh, sure. Look, the cosmos existed for hundreds of millions of years before there were any conscious creatures, as far as we know. So it existed independently of minds, and if minds never involved, it would still have been there. So reality does not depend on my mind or anybody else's. Can you know reality? Well, we seem to do a pretty good job by and large. Otherwise, you know, we wouldn't have the technology which is allowing this conversation. As for the thing in itself, well, I don't know what that is. It's a Kantian philosophy that I've always found particularly inscrutable. John's driving home and he runs his car into a telegraph pole, nearly cripples himself. Did he run into a thing in itself? Quite possibly. He ran into a tree. Right. That's thing enough.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's perhaps you know, the more common sense. There are common sense problems to the position. I certainly see those. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Graham. Just a random kind of email from me. The last question that I keep asking for one of my subscribers who he's just been accepted at Oxford to go and study philosophy and theology, and he wants me to ask, you know, what advice you'd give to someone who's just kind of starting out on their journey into philosophy, especially academic philosophy, and you know, how they should approach their future in it.
What a question.
Yeah.
Okay, take a step back. The things you're going to do best at in life are the things you enjoy, the things you're engaged with. Okay. Now, presumably the person who asked the question is going to go and study these things because they're engaged with the issues. I presume they're not going because studying philosophy is going to get them a job. It's not like studying law or medicine. Maybe if the person's studying theology, maybe they want to be a priest, but I'm assuming that's not the case. They're doing these things because they find them engaging intellectually. If they go to university, I hope they will continue to find these things engaging. If they don't, they should get out and do something else. There are lots of things that happen at university which can kill off your engagement. I think we've all had good teachers and bad teachers. Good teachers can make subjects live, bad teachers can kill anything. Okay. So I hope the person who asked the question has the good luck to have good teachers and they make the areas live for them. So a bit of advice might be to seek out good teachers as far as you can. And if you're not getting the kind of stimulation you want to make yourself, to maintain your interest, well, you can try and do other things. You can find people to talk to. You can read books that you find stimulating. If that doesn't work, then my advice would be to get out. But, you know, I became a philosopher many years ago because I find the subject fascinating, the questions challenging, and I've been doing it now for a long time, longer than I care to remember, and I still find it so. There's plenty of stuff in philosophy to keep you engaged. And philosophy is an enormously broad subject. You know, you can be talking about philosophy of quantum mechanics one day, philosophy of art another day, philosophy of God another day. These are, you know, big differences. Not all parts of philosophy interest everybody. That's fine. So maybe another bit of advice is, do the bits of philosophy which find you engaging. I mean, you go to university, you're going to be taught lots of different things, and all is good for your philosophical education, but you're going to be engaged with more with some things than others, and that's entirely fine. Engage with the bits that you find engaging. Okay, that's a rather rambling answer, I'm afraid, but
no, I think it's a good one.
It's the best improvise on the spot.
Yeah, and I think the advice about if it isn't right as well, getting out, I think that could be good for a lot of people who, because people are forced into making a lot of these decisions so young. I think about what are you going to study, and if you want to do post grad, for the next 6-8 years of your life, and often if you're being forced to make these decisions at 18, just by the way the system's set up, you're going to be a completely different person by 21, 22. So
yeah, I mean, there's an issue with the British education system in that you specialize very early, and when you go to university you essentially do one thing, so you become even more specialized. This is not true in many education systems such as those of Australia and the United States.
right.
But it means that you may well make unfortunate choices. So when I went to university, I was reading mathematics, and I think half of the cohort in the college I was in doing mathematics changed and did something else, as they discovered they were more interested in economics, psychology, philosophy. Fortunately, I went to a university where changing was relatively easy.
Yeah.
It isn't always, but if you find your interests moving such that you really are losing interest in what you thought you were interested in, and you're getting interested in something else, well, the sensible thing is to change, I think.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's even just me personally, just even getting to university because of the funding situations and everything like that is very difficult, because I feel like my life is sort of almost on the train tracks, and everything keeps moving, and now I've got to support things financially and so forth, and then to go, oh, I'm just gonna, here's a magic £10,000 a year for postgraduate this and that, and it doesn't doesn't exist. So I think it's very difficult to get into as well. So
yeah, that's true. Academic life for you guys, I mean, people of your age, is much more difficult than when I went through university, which was a long time ago. There were no university fees in those days. There were maintenance grants provided by local educational authorities. So I didn't have the kind of financial worries that you've got. And if you went to a good university in my day, you expected to get a good job, and that expectation was normally fulfilled. That is no longer the case. So life is harder for people of your age, and that's certainly true. But remember that life is long, or at least you hope it's going to be long, right?
right.
And you're probably going to finish your education by the time you're 25, maybe. You've got nearly the whole of your life in front of you. Okay. So you can afford to spend a year or two, fine-tuning your studying to get things right, if it's going to make life better for you, through most of your life. Don't be pressured into doing things hurriedly, such a way that you screw up the rest of your life.
Yeah, I think that's some good advice for me. Well, I really appreciate that you've had taken the time out of your day to have this conversation with me, and it's been useful for me because I find all these things interesting, and I think a lot of people have appreciated it in the chat as well. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
Well, you're very welcome. Obviously, most of us living in difficult times at the moment. I mean, I'm hunkered down at home, you are, and I would guess that most of the people listening are. So let's hope that the current situation gets better as soon as may be possible. And in the end, we've got to be patient and make the best of things.
Well, thanks for that, Graham. I'll end the meeting there if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah. See, and yeah, hope you have a good time in quarantine, and you know.
Same to you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. See you. Bye.